Have you ever held a secret so tight that you felt like you would burst? Hello, everyone, and welcome to Love Unexpected, a true story that will take you on a romantic journey that I promise will make you smile, sigh, and believe in the power of love. I'm your host, Tom Howie. This amazing story follows a young woman named Dawn Lawson, who had the experience of a lifetime as she traveled through Poland and Ukraine in 1992, shortly after they had become free from communist control. Her adventure is filled with unexpected turns, twists, and revelations sure to capture your heart and imagination. So let's dive into the story of how she found love that she never expected from across the sea. Thank you for joining us. Off we go. All right, Dawn, so you've arrived back in the U.S. after probably the single most eventful 2 weeks of a first time overseas anyone has ever experienced. Now you're back to reality, as they say. Things are anything but normal for you. You're returning home with a fiance, a daughter, that you've had to leave them back in Poland, and they're waiting for a visitor's visa to visit the U.S. But this has to be a surprise for everyone. I mean, I'm really curious, how did you tell them and how did they take the news?
Well, Tom, I didn't tell anyone about Viashik or Sarah when I got home back to Maryland.
You're kidding me. You didn't tell them anything?
No, and for a couple of reasons. First, I was just physically tired, and I just wanted to catch up on my sleep before going back into the classroom. I'd left Warsaw that afternoon, flown 8 hours to New York City, and then transferred to Baltimore. And since we still had a week of school left, I just wanted to crawl into bed and sleep for 24 hours. And that's the only way I thought I could be awake and focused enough for my students. The second was that knowing that once I shared the news, everyone would want to know the whole story of how we'd met, who he was, when is he going to come here? And I still needed time to process those 2 weeks for myself, before I told others. And then finally, I really wanted to tell my parents first before I told other people, but I wasn't going to see them for a little over a week.
I think all that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, that school year, I'd been renting a room from an older woman named Peg Zabawa. Her late husband, Jules, was of a Polish descent, and their last name, Zabawa, actually means celebration in Polish, and she was so proud of that.
That is really interesting. I mean, is this almost like another signpost along the way, correct?
Yes, living with this woman who's married to a Polish man, and I'll tell you, there's even more to tell you about that signpost. Anyway, one of the first things I did when I got back to her house was call my parents to let them know that I had made it home safely from Europe. Because remember, in 1992, there wasn't a cell phone, there wasn't Skype, there wasn't WhatsApp. So they hadn't heard from me since I'd left. So while I talked to my dad, he asked, "Did you meet anyone special while you were there?"
You're kidding me. He actually asked you that?
Yes, he did. I couldn't tell my parents over the phone, but I was engaged to someone they had never met. I mean, this news required context and backstory. And like I said, I was too exhausted to get into it. So I answered my dad saying, "Yes, everyone was special. I feel like that I have family and friends forever." And that was all true. My parents knew that I hadn't renewed my contract with the school in Maryland for the next year. So they were planning to drive up the following week and help me bring my belongings back to Tennessee. I thought it was best just to wait until we were face to face and tell them the news of my engagement then. But Tom, here's an interesting piece of information for you that Dad told me later. Do you remember Sue? That woman who told me in January that she'd been praying for me and that God revealed to her that I'd be going on that outreach trip to Eastern Europe?
Yeah, she's the one that said that in that year you would go on a trip, she's praying for you, and that you would meet your husband in 1992. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, that Saturday night, just a week before, that was the Saturday when I heard God's voice in Kiev tell me that I was waiting for Viashik. And then he showed me that V was my other half. Well, Sue had been praying for me that weekend. And that next day, after I heard and I saw from God, she approached my dad in Tennessee and she told him that she'd been praying for me that weekend and that God told her I had met my husband on the trip.
You were kidding me. So how did he respond to that?
Well, of course, Dad was curious. He wanted to know if this was true, and that's why he was asking me if I'd met anyone special on the trip. And again, I was really vague and had told him, well, Dad, everyone was special. Tom, of course, Dad didn't tell me what Sue had said on the phone. So, since I'd been so vague, he just assumed that I hadn't met my husband. So that next day, because it was a Saturday night when I got home and I called him, and the next day he went to church and he told Sue that she was wrong. He said I hadn't met my husband on the trip, but Sue stood firm and she said, I don't believe it. I know she's met him. Either she doesn't know it yet or she doesn't want to tell you about it.
Wow, that's amazing. And the fact that your dad even asked you that and then slipped in something, all cool, like, oh no, everybody was special. That's awesome.
Well, I knew that keeping Viashik a secret was going to be difficult because it seemed that everyone was asking me if I'd met Mr. Right on this trip. I had been on this outreach trip to Ukraine and Poland, and everyone was asking me about my love life instead of my trip. In fact, the first thing my goddaughter's family asked when they picked me up at the airport was, so did you meet Mr. Right while you were there?
Well, you've never mentioned a goddaughter. Tell us about her.
Well, I suppose she would be another signpost from God. Of all things, her name is Sarah, and at that time she was 7 years old.
Okay, so back in Poland, Viashik's daughter is Sarah.
Yes.
And she was, 7 or 8 years old as well?
She's 7 years old.
Wow.
Yes, so Sarah, my goddaughter, had my heart more than any other child. And now my heart was getting prepared for another princess, which is what Sarah means. But this princess was from Poland.
Okay, if you are looking for signposts in your life at this point, they're everywhere.
I know. Isn't that amazing? So Linda, my goddaughter's mother, had asked me if I'd met Mr. Right on the trip. And then when she dropped me off at Peg's house, I walked in the door and Peg said, have you met Mr. Right on the trip? I was continually diverting conversations that entire week. But Tom, I'll have to tell you, a few days later I cracked and I shared the news with someone.
All right, so you're finishing up your last week of teaching in Maryland, and then you're moving back to Tennessee. Dawn, you've decided to keep the engagement a secret for the time being, which I find extraordinary. How did you and V communicate without anyone finding out? Did you communicate?
We did, sort of, because it was so difficult. And honestly, Tom, I really hadn't thought about it when I left Poland. Viashik tried to call me at Peg's house, but because of the 6-hour time difference between Warsaw and Maryland, I missed his calls every time. And I had end-of-the-year activities that I had to work on at school because I just missed 2 weeks, which means there's a lot of grading to do. And so I had to catch up on that grading. I had to take care of activities for that week. So I didn't get home until after 4 o'clock each day. So I kept missing his calls.
So you said he didn't have a phone at his apartment, though, right?
Right. He didn't. The government was still controlling the wiring of homes and phones. People had requested phone installation, and they were just put on this wait list that lasted for years. And poor Viashik, he'd been waiting for 3 years and had no phone.
So how was he calling you?
Well, he had to go to the post office where they had this public phone booths, and there he would make very expensive long-distance phone calls. Sometimes he would get lucky and be able to call from a phone at his best friend's house.
Well, long-distance calls back in that time, or phone cards, that is, were remarkably expensive, right?
Yes, they were. And since he didn't have a phone, I couldn't call him. So I sent him faxes via his church or his brother's fax machine. I didn't have access to a fax machine at work, so I went to the postal store and sent them from there. I'd tell him about my day, how much I missed him, and then Vishik would get the fax, but he couldn't send a fax back to me. So we were kind of stuck. He could call me, I couldn't call him. I could send him a fax, but he couldn't fax me back. So again, because of my having to wrap up the end of the school year and coming home after 4, which was after 10 p.m. in Warsaw, I just continued to miss his calls.
So this has got to be very frustrating for you both. I mean, obviously, you didn't think all of this through when you left Poland.
No, and it was extremely frustrating. And Peg, the woman that I lived with, she became frustrated too. She was the one who'd answer the phone whenever Vishik would call, and she just assumed because of his accent that he was one of my Ukrainian ballet friends that were still in Philadelphia. Peg was getting so perturbed that this guy, who introduced himself as Willie, kept calling every day. And finally on Thursday, after coming home and finding out that she had just hung up the phone with Willie, and I had missed his call again, Tom, I had a little breakdown. I hurried into my room and I dramatically threw myself onto my bed. I think I'd hit my tipping point with the combination of holding in the news that I had a fiance and missing his calls and then writing him secret letters. All this, while just trying to get through this last week of school, had made me like a mental and emotional mess. After the way I had dramatically exited, naturally Peg came into my room to find out what was wrong. Tom, I just couldn't hold in the secret anymore, and I told her, Willie wasn't a Ukrainian. He was Polish, and that he was calling from Warsaw. And then I said, Peg, he's my fiancé. Her face just lit up. She said, fiancé, huh? Come on, I'm taking you out to dinner, and you can tell me all about him. So she drove me to this really nice restaurant in Columbia overlooking a lake, and I told her the whole story about Vishik and Sarah. And since her husband was Polish, and the two of them had also been in music and even recorded songs from operas, when she found out the fact that my future husband was a Polish musician that recorded music as well, it just simply delighted her. She just giggled, and her whole being just lit up. She was immediately enchanted with Vishik, and so I can tell you, finally telling her the truth just lifted a huge weight off of me. So I decided to go ahead and tell my friends in Maryland about my engagement, even before I told my parents. Many of them had sponsored me financially to take the trip, and they were so invested in the trip because they had befriended the dancers in 1990 when we hosted them for Christmas. So on Sunday afternoon, a week after returning from Eastern Europe, I was scheduled to share at our school building all about my trip.
All right, so I want to pick it up there. You're on Sunday, June 7th, when you finally tell your friends in Maryland about V. And how did that go?
Well, first, I just told 2 friends. They were kind of my rehearsal. Lisa, who had taught school with me there in Maryland, was in town with her new husband. And she had just gotten married a couple of months before to this guy named James, who was a friend of mine in Tennessee, and now they lived in Tennessee. And the 2 of them came up to visit her family. Tom, Lisa was the friend who had also joined me in Baltimore and in Philadelphia visiting the dancers of the Donetsk Ballet. So she was really wanting to hear about my trip. Well, the 3 of us went to lunch after church, and I told her the whole story about the trip and how God had to wake me up to see that Vishik was the one he had for me. Lisa and James were very happy and excited for me, and telling them the story was good practice for me because I was going to be repeating it to a larger group of people in just a couple of hours. So that afternoon, there were probably about 30 people at the school to hear about my trip. I shared the story in detail, of course, minus the relationship with Vishik. I just stuck to the ministry events that occurred and the traveling, And I also passed around photos from the trip and samples of Polish sugar cubes and toilet paper and Ukrainian coupons and pins and other items that I'd collected during those 2 weeks. And one of the really great things was that most of those who were listening to my story had met both Olga and Natasha in 1990 when they were dancing the Nutcracker in Baltimore.
That's actually really, really cool.
Yes. Tom, I don't think I told you, but as a thank you for the Christmas party that we threw for the Ukrainian dancers, the ballet company gave tickets to the church to come see the Nutcracker for free. And several families went to see it on the Saturday after Christmas. Then, after that performance, Olga and Natasha and 3 other dancers stayed the night with families from the church, and then they all attended the church service the next morning. So when I shared the parts of the story about Olga and Natasha traveling from Russia and somehow finding me in Kiev, it was extra special for everyone there. So after sharing about my 2 weeks, I concluded my presentation by saying, and I came back with a fiancé. Any questions? It was completely silent in the room. Everyone just had this stunned look across their faces.
I would imagine so.
Then suddenly a hand went up, and I have a friend named Rudy who's a scientist, and he said, "Did you see any fallout from Chernobyl?" And no, I didn't, I responded. It was such a Rudy thing to say. And he still jokes about this with me. In fact, I got a text from him recently talking about it. Well, I think that gave everyone else some time to kind of absorb and process the last statement I dropped on them. And then they began asking me questions like, "Did you say fiance?" And that led me into telling Vieshik's story and how God brought us together.
Okay, so I want to get into the part where you finally tell your parents, because I know my parents, had they found out that 30 plus 2 and 1 had heard long before they would not have been happy people, my parents.
Okay, so I did ask everyone to please not say anything to my parents about Vieshik.
You know what they say, the only way that 3 people can keep a secret is if 2 of them are dead.
Oh.
So
So Mom and Dad were arriving the next day, and so that's what I was going to be telling them. But I just needed to tell them in my own way. Now, Peg, the woman that I was renting the room from, was known across Colombia for her delicious cooking, especially her soups and her breads. In fact, she was very famous in the city for a restaurant she once had. It was called Mrs. Z's. And so she helped me make this really nice dinner for my parents. And for dessert, I knew I had to make a banana cream pie.
okay, now I've got to know where the word had. You absolutely had to make banana cream pie. Why is this?
This is a tradition that goes back to when I was 16. I wasn't allowed to date till I was 16. And my dad said that before I could go on a date with a boy, the young man would need to come over to our house for dinner so that Dad could talk to him, which you know is a cue word for I'm going to scare him a little bit. And then as part of the deal, if I really wanted to date the boy, I would need to make my dad's favorite dessert.
And I guess that would be banana cream pie.
Yep. And
All right.
Tom, I'm pretty good at making banana cream pie now. So that night, after we had dinner, I pulled out the photos that didn't show Vieshik and me together and the items that I'd brought with me, and I told them almost all the details of my trip. And then I ended by saying, I really wanted to bring you a souvenir from the trip, but since the dancers have already given you several gifts from Ukraine, I thought I'd bring you something from Poland. I know you don't like things that you just put on the shelf and you have to dust, so I thought I'd get you something different. Then I reached into my bag that had the photos of Vieshik and Sarah, and I thought I was pulling out a picture of Vieshik, but instead I pulled out a photo of Sarah, and I quickly said, "So I brought you and I saw it was Sarah, and I said, "A granddaughter instead." Well, my parents weren't quite sure what I meant by that. Mom thought that I was going to adopt an orphan. They were delighted, and they commented on how beautiful and sweet she looked. And then I finally found the photo of Viashik and me, and I presented it to them, and she comes with a father, I said. This is my fiancé. I'm engaged. This is when my parents were really excited, and when my dad told me about his exchange with Sue at church, when she had told him that I had met my husband on the trip.
And that's when he looked at you and said, "And you lied to me."
So anyway, of course, now I had to tell my parents the whole story of how I fought against what God was doing the first week, and that he had audibly spoken to me and shown me that Viashik was my husband in order to kind of wake me up to that last week so I could step into the relationship. Then after that, how I had said yes to the relationship and how fast everything accelerated that second week. So, Tom, here's where I brought out the banana cream pie, and I asked my dad, "Dad, can I keep him?"
Did you let him eat it first before he said yes, or did he even say yes?
He said absolutely yes. Both Mom and Dad were really happy, and that's when Dad told me about an encounter he had had with God a couple years before. Back when I was probably a senior in college, he was sitting on the couch praying for me and my future husband like he did every day. And in the middle of his prayer, God interrupted him and said, "Stop. You don't need to pray for her husband anymore. I've already got the young man set aside for her. And when they meet, they will have such a desire for each other that they'll be married within 90 days.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Love Unexpected. To see photos and video clips that go along with this story, go to our website, loveunexpected.us. You can find the link in our episode guide. We would love to hear from you, so email your comments and questions at our website. If you enjoyed the show, we would love for you to share our podcast with your family and friends. You can listen to Love Unexpected on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Be sure to hit the subscribe and notification buttons so that you don't miss a single episode of our show. You can help us by leaving a rating as well as a comment or review. We look forward to connecting with you on social media. Our username @LoveUnexpectedPodcast on both Instagram and Facebook. Our producer and creator of original music for the show is Joe EP Music. Our host, Tom Howey. Our writer is Dawn Prushkovsky. Our media manager is Jane Prushkovsky.